Okay, this is going to be the first screencast for evolution, which is a big, chunky, lots of information in this unit. All right, so the other units have been kind of fast, like genetics and biotech, and this one is a longer one. So we'll be doing genetics, or sorry, evolution for a little while. All right, and my new favorite thing is to, when I try to change to my iPad, try to make a really weird face. So my face is paused in some weird way. So wait for it. Ready? I really hope that worked. I hope my face was paused in a weird way for you, for your entertainment. And Zoom. Okay. All right. So let me just fix my screen so I can see some things. And I think this should work. All right. Okay. So this is going to be an introduction to evolution, which is chapter 22. Good information on Khan Academy and Mr. Anderson. So if you want quick little ways to look at things, those are great. Good way to study. So the first thing is, why are we studying evolution? Who cares? And there's so many cool reasons to study evolution. First off, there is a huge amount of biodiversity on our planet. And it's really fun and interesting to think about how it all came about. All right. So for example, the narwhal, which has this crazy elongated left tooth. This is an axolotl that has a little amphibian with these external gills. They're very, very cute. This is a pacu fish. That's like a piranha, but they eat plants. And if you zoom in, check it out. Their teeth look like human teeth. Ah, so weird. This is a little pink fairy armadillo. And this is a yeti crab that has this very furry little kind of pincers where bacteria kind of live and make it this kind of furry environment for them. So very crazy. So there's a huge biodiversity, and it's really interesting to think about where that came from. But among that huge biodiversity, there's also a huge amount of similarities between organisms, right? We see a big amount of similarities within body plans, within their embryos, and we see that all throughout the fossil record as well, right? The key observations about life when we're thinking about kind of evolution, I'm going to actually start on the third. One, there's a huge biodiversity, rich, huge biodiversity of life. Life also shares many characteristics, and a key point that Darwin actually made is that organisms seem highly adapted for their particular environment. Right? And so I want to get out there and define evolution at the very beginning here. So evolution can be defined as descent with modification. And you're kind of like, what is that? And what that means is that living species are descendants of ancestral species, which were fundamentally different. All right. So if we look at kind of elephant evolution here, we have both African and Asian elephants that are current species, right? They have evolved from these earlier species, all of which were fundamentally different than the species that is in existence today, all right? And so I always like to think of it as that in terms of chimpanzees and humans. People are always saying incorrectly that humans evolved from chimpanzees. No, no, no. Chimpanzees are highly evolved species. Humans are highly evolved species. They might have a common ancestor, but that ancestor is fundamentally different than the current alive species. We did not evolve from chimpanzees. We may have had, and probably did have, a common ancestor, right? Another kind of way of defining evolution is a genetic change in a population over many generations. So one thing to really think about is individuals cannot evolve. Only populations of organisms evolve, and that has to occur over several generations. All right. And when I mean a genetic change, how do genetic changes come about? What is a genetic change? It is a mutation. So I'm talking about literal mutations or changes in that DNA sequence. Okay, so I want to give you a little historical perspective on evolution and the theories leading up to evolution. So it was originally thought that there was a creator that made all the species which were fixed and unchanging with varying levels of complexity, but fixed and unchanging, all right? Linnaeus, somebody you may have heard about, was somebody that believed greatly in a creator, but was also very interested in trying to classify life's diversity. And he did that by naming things, right? He had a taxonomy or a way of naming. And he used what is called a binomial naming system, where he used 2 words for every organism. And you may have heard this, right? Genus and species, right? And we are in the genus Homo, and our species is sapien. So humans are Homo sapiens, and we're still using today Linnaeus's kind of naming system. So he existed in he thought that there was a creator, but this naming system that he came up with is still used today. All right, and here's a timeline leading up to Darwin. All right. So if we look at this, we are going to talk about, we already talked about Linnaeus, who believed in a creator, but he also came up with this taxonomy. We're going to talk briefly about Hutton, Lamarck. We're going to skip over Matthias, and we're going to talk about Cuvier, briefly Lyell, and then Darwin and Wallace. And we already talked about Mendel. All right. So these are very brief. I just want to bring them up because they're important to kind of understand the historical perspective of evolution. So first was Hutton. He was a geologist, and he believed in a theory called gradualism that kind of states that changes over time take place through a gradual and continuous process. All right. Then along came Cuvier, which obviously you probably know because of the street near Bishop's. And he came up with this different theory. He was a paleontologist, meaning he studied bones and fossils. And he saw these strata or these layers of earth that contain different fossils. And they noted the deeper you go, the older the fossil. Cool. But he saw, because these were in these distinct strata, he came up with a theory called catastrophism, where there were certain global events that cause this cyclical kind of destruction of life and then recreation of life. So every strata, there was destruction and then creation, right? Then came Lyell, I guess. He was a geologist as well, and he built on what Hutton came up with, this gradualism, and he came up with a theory called uniformitarianism. And it was very similar to gradualism. So if you get confused on them, makes sense. They're really similar. And he believed that the mechanisms of change are constant over time. So there's a gradual process. And the big difference is that the mechanisms that were at work many, many years ago are the same ones at work today. And he was the first to really show that the earth was very, very, very old. Okay, then came one of my favorite, Jean-Baptiste de Lamarck. And he goes down in history as kind of like the laughing stock. But at the time, his theories were super important, and they were published, and they were thought to be the the theories that really kind of ruled at the time. So here's Lamarck. Oh, look at him. He was born he published these theories the year that Darwin was born. All right. And his 2 theories of evolution are use and disuse. And what that means is that if an organism uses a certain trait a lot in their lifetime, then they would kind of pass that along. If they didn't use a trait, it would go away. And so, for example, this here giraffe did not use his long neck to eat these plants that were kind of low. And so that's disuse. And so his offspring would then not have a long neck. Whereas this giraffe that had to strain to reach those big trees, he used his long neck, and therefore his offspring, his babies, would also have that long neck, right? So use and disuse. The other thing is that this kind of goes along with it, is called the inheritance of acquired traits. That means that any trait that you acquire in your lifetime will be passed on to your babies. So for example, two traits that Arnold has here are he pumped his muscles, meaning that his babies would have really strong muscles. And the other thing that I noticed about him, he spent a lot of time in the sun. He's super tan, meaning his baby would be super tan, right? We know that this is ridiculous, but at the time, Jean-Baptiste de Lamarck was the ruler of all things, and we now know that all of this is false. It was proved scientifically not to be true. All right, then comes Darwin, the father of evolution. So one of the first things he started looking at when he was a young boy was he started looking and witnessing artificial selection, right? So artificial selection is the same thing that Neil deGrasse Tyson started talking about in that snippet that I showed you. It's selective breeding of domesticated plants or animals for desirable traits. So for example, if we wanted to domesticate a dog, we would pick the most calm dog of the wolf pack, mate that with another calm dog, hoping to get more calm dogs, and continue until you get that. You could do the same for features that were for like hunting dogs or for dogs that were very fast or whatever it was. And you could do the same for plants, right? And he also made two big observations about this artificial selection. One, members of a population have many variabilities in their traits, all right? And that species often make a lot more offspring than they need, meaning many die, all right? So here we have snails with a huge variability. And he was particularly interested in plants. And you notice that this is a fungus, and it's releasing millions of spores. That's a lot more babies than you need, right? Many actually end up dying. So this brings us to the Darwinian Revolution. So Charles Darwin had a consuming interest in nature. He actually ended up leaving medical school to become a botanist. That's like my kind of guy. Interested primarily in plants, right? And in 1831, he accepted a position as a naturalist aboard the HMS Beagle. And you may be familiar with this journey, but he went from Europe down to South America, around South America, ended up spending a lot of time on the Galapagos Islands, which I'm sure you've heard about, around to Australia, New Zealand, Tasmania rather, all the way to Africa, to South America, and back to Europe, right? This is called the Voyage of the Beagle. That's, again, the little boat that went around, and Darwin collected a ton of flora, meaning plants, and fauna, meaning life, organisms, not plants, I guess animals. And he compared unknown species with fossil records. And in particular, he spent a lot of time on islands. All right. And islands are very unique in terms of evolution. And he noticed a lot of these unique geographical distributions. All right. So for example, if you focus on the Galapagos Island, every island had unique finches. And even though they looked similar, they all were different depending on the food source. So for example, if this island had, I'm going to just say big fat seeds, then the finches seem to have big fat beaks. And then the islands that had very little seeds had finches with little beaks, right? He also noticed that the organisms that were the closest to the mainland Like this island looked most similar to the mainland. And as you went farther out, it looked less and less like the mainland. All right. So finches on each island were unique species, not interbreeding, and the beak shape matched the food sources. Okay, so Darwin and this famous, awesome guy who didn't get nearly enough credit, named Alfred Russel Wallace, both came up with the same idea more or less at the same time, right? So Russel Wallace was a naturalist on the South Pacific Islands. So they both studied these island environments. And he published a theory that was almost identical to Darwin. And notice, he publishes in 1858. Notice, Darwin publishes in 1859. Who gets more credit? Darwin. So Darwin, after reading Wallace's work, said this: "I never saw a more striking coincidence. So all of my originality, whatever it may amount to, will be smashed." But Wallace is a standout, awesome individual. And he actually admitted that he admired Darwin's work and suggested that since Darwin's theories had been studied so extensively, that Darwin should be known for this theory, even though Wallace published it first. So they came up with it together, really. They had the same ideas, but Darwin is really the guy that gets credit. And I want to mention that the word evolution is not even in his original Origin of Species. All right. So that's a word that kind of came later. So his ideas that were in the Origin of Species were adaptation and natural selection. All right. He states, "It is not the strongest of the species that survive, nor the most intelligent. It's the one that responds to change." All right. And what I mean by that is that it's the organisms that have the ability to adapt. All right. So adaptation is an inherited trait of an organism that enhances its survival and reproduction. Right. So adaptation is very important for his big theory on evolution called natural selection. So natural selection states those with favorable inherited traits tend to survive and reproduce at high rates because of those traits. In other words, better adapted organisms survive and reproduce to pass along their genetics or their genes. All right. So you may have heard survival of the fittest. It is not survival of the fittest. It's survival of the fittest and the ones that can have babies, right? It's really about that reproduction that is really important for the theory of natural selection. I just want to point out again, individuals cannot evolve, only populations. All right. So if you think of adaptations, what adaptations, you think of any organism that you want and think of how they're adapted to their environment. What traits enhance their survival and reproduction? So if we think of a polar bear, I immediately think of the white fur that allows them to camouflage against their environment. I think of strong teeth and claws. They actually have black skin that helps them stay warm, et cetera, et cetera. And you can do this for any organism. All right, so evolution is really, again, can be defined as descent with modification, right? This kind of summarizes Darwin's unity of life. All organisms have some unity of life. They share similarities. In other words, all organisms are related through some ancestor that lived in the remote past. All right. And there are amazing and stunning observations that show all organisms have these similarities. And they figured this out before we knew what DNA was, right? Now we can actually sequence the DNA and show similarities. So like, oh my God, the DNA sequence is the same in bacteria and humans. Like, that's wild. But we didn't know that at the time. So they had to look at structural features. So just a couple examples, the leg bones in horses are nearly identical in structure and function to the human, even though we have totally different modes of transportation. The neck in a giraffe and a human both have the same number of vertebrae, even though the giraffe is 6 feet tall, right? Very interesting. So there must be some old ancestor that we're all related to, all right? And we call that LUCA, the last universal common ancestor. So if you look at phylogenetic trees, which help to show relationships between organisms, all the modern day species are out here, kind of the very ends of the tree, but the root of the tree must have our LUCA, the last universal common ancestor, right? And you can just see that on any kind of phylogenetic tree, that the LUCA is way down here. And even if you look at bacteria and our eukaryote, and this other weird one called archaea, which we'll talk about later, there must have been a LUCA, or a last universal common ancestor, for that as well. All right, and we will stop there for this. Stop.